It's time now for the big question, in which we tackle a major news story of the day from multiple points of view. Smacking and slapping children has been outlawed in Wales, with people told to contact social services or police if they see a parent or carer meting out physical punishment. The law change, which came into force first thing on Monday of this week, was hailed as historic by the Labour-led Welsh Government and a number of child protection champions who called for England to do just the same, to outlaw smacking. But critics, including the Welsh Conservatives, expressed concerns that it would criminalise parents trying to do their best and create a snitch culture, with people shopping their neighbours and even making malicious allegations. So what do we think about this? Should smacking children be illegal? To debate this topic, I'm delighted to welcome Tam Laird, leader of the Scottish Libertarian Party, Dr. Bernard Gallagher, independent child protection researcher, and Anna May Mangan, author and, very importantly, a mother. Let's speak, first of all, to Tom Laird. Tom, do you think that smacking should be against the law?
It's my view. I mean, the party has varying views within it, so there isn't one libertarian position. My view is I'm not prepared to criminalise parents for smacking. I think there's already adequate laws against the abuse and the beating of children. I believe in peaceful parenting. I'm an advocate of peaceful parenting. I think there's a better, more excellent way of dealing with children and dealing in discipline, but I'm not prepared. Yeah, look, it's all very well making laws, but when you make a law, you have to back up that law with force and violence. Otherwise, it's not a law, it's merely a suggestion. So I'm not prepared to use force against parents and lock them up in a cage beside murderers and rapists, or fine them, or worse still, take their kids off them because they've smacked. And I think there's a real danger here of state overreach. If this was an isolated thing, fair enough, but I think over the last couple of years, we've seen some real state overreach into private institutions, into the family, and an attack on parental responsibility. So that's a concern to me, and that's a concern to libertarians. And the idea, frankly, that government cares about your children is, frankly, and in the circumstances of the last 2 years, preposterous.
But Tam, if this legislation prevents abuse against just one child, surely it's worth it.
I don't see that it can. Law never prevented anything. All the law does is allows you to punish after the event. And there's already adequate provision within the law to deal with people who beat and abuse their children. So while, again, I say I'm for peaceful parenting, I think it's the best method, but I'm not prepared to criminalise people who smack. And I certainly won't be grassing up anybody I see giving out what I would think would maybe be reasonable chastisement, depending on the circumstances.
Anna May Mangan,
but that's just a personal opinion.
Yeah, fair enough, and that's what it's all about, Tam, and we're pleased that you've expressed it on the show. I'll come back to you shortly. Anna May Mangan, what's your view? Should smacking be illegal?
It certainly should be illegal. It's brutalising little children. In a couple, a husband wouldn't get away with whacking his wife, or vice versa. So why would you do it to the smallest and most vulnerable person in your family? It doesn't make any sense at all. And I'm not suggesting a van goes out and rounds everybody up who has been described as smacking their children. I think what this law does is it makes a change, like a cultural change. It's the start of a change. Often it takes a generation for this to come about. I mean, if you think about seatbelts, very few people don't put their seatbelts out. We don't send children up chimneys anymore. Yeah, we move on and we learn. And the whole point of discipline is to change a child's behaviour. So what are you teaching them by smacking them? You're only encouraging them to smack their siblings or to smack the child sat next to them in class. It's old-fashioned, it's outdated, and I think people recognise it as a form of what? It's violence. Yeah, it's violence.
Dr. Bernard Gallagher, you are an independent child protection researcher. What's your view? Does this law do more harm than good, as suggested by Tam Laird?
I don't think it will do any harm. I agree with Anna May that It is wrong to smack children. They're the only group in society that in England we're currently allowed to smack. We're not allowed to smack our partners. We're not allowed to smack our colleagues. So why are we allowed to smack children? The other point I'd like to make is that basically parents aren't going to get prosecuted for smacking their parents. I can understand that people are fearful of that, but that isn't going to happen in the vast majority of cases. What it's important to bear in mind here about this legislation in Wales, and Scotland has it already, and I believe 62 other countries have it, it's symbolic. It's trying to discourage violence in the home. Now, I'm not saying, I make it crystal clear, I think any smacking of any child is wrong, but, that's not as serious as some of the abuse cases I've spent my career studying. And some of us will remember the case of Arthur Lavinia Hughes and Star Hobson's 2 young children that were murdered by their parents, and the parents were convicted fairly recently. Now, what I'm trying to say is that this law has a symbolic value to discourage violence in the home in general, and that will actually save some serious abuse cases, because it's sending out a general message that violence is wrong. And I think all of us would want to agree with that message, that violence is wrong in whatever form. Let's try and do as much as we can to discourage it. Let's have a change of attitude, because for too long, too many societies have been wedded, almost obsessed with the idea that they should have this right to smack children. They don't need that. There's smacking isn't effective anyway, and there's far more effective ways of caring for your children.
However, Anna May Mangan, there's a difference, isn't there, between somebody that cruelly abuses their child, for which, as Tam Laird points out, there are laws in place, and a normal parent that just taps their child symbolically on the wrist because they tried to run across the road. In Wales now, you could get your kids taken off you for doing that.
It has lost control, and it's about their loss of control, not what.
What, this?
Done.
Is that a loss of control?
An idea about what justifies it.
It's a signal.
My favourite remark is, it was only a little tap. Well, if it was only a little tap, why are you doing it? Why don't you reason with them? Why don't you talk to them? Why don't you get down to their level? Why don't you give them an evil stare? I mean, that's what my mother used to do to me, and it worked. And other things parents who slap say, it didn't do me any harm. But of course it did, because they're doing it to their child. So it's perpetuating the cycle. And I'm delighted that this law's come in, because it's going to modify people's behaviour, not instantly, but over a period of time.
Although, Anna May Mangan, I'm wondering where you draw the line, because if a child, let's say, is behaving badly in a restaurant, if you scoop them out of their seats and manhandle them outside to have a conversation with them about their behaviour, or let's take that example of a child that is about to step into the road, you want to send them a message that what they've just done could be fatal. And if you therefore physically communicate that message, that will serve them well in life.
Yeah, so you give them a big smack for that. Where does that get you? It doesn't teach them anything. It teaches them to hit their little brother or sister. It's interesting, actually, because I've been in restaurants where a lot of adults behave really, really badly, and they don't slap each other. They get drunk, they misbehave, and everyone tolerates that. So why can't you tolerate a little child behaving badly for a while? There's ways to teach and train them, not smacking them. Imagine a giant walked into the studio now and he was 2 or 3 times your height and gave you what he described as a little slap. He'd probably knock you out. And you'd be terrified. I mean, that is what it must feel like to a child when an adult bears down on them.
It would be great for our ratings, though. I mean, I'd pay to see that. Let's come back to you, Tam Laird, about this, because I think what's also at play here is the issue of parental autonomy, which I would have thought, as the leader of the Scottish Libertarian Party, is a concern of yours.
Well, of course it is. But let me be absolutely clear. I'm not advocating smacking your kids. I believe in peaceful parenting. I think it's a good idea. There are many good arguments for peaceful parenting. I don't think you wouldn't do it to an adult is a strong argument. You wouldn't pick up an adult and strap them into the back seat of your car and force them to go down to the supermarket with you and drag them round the shops. Or there's probably a lot of blokes shouting at the screen at this point, tell that to my missus. But no, I'm not for smacking children. But I'm just not prepared to criminalise parents for this. Some horrific stories coming out of Norway at the moment of people who are having their children taken away from them for the slightest thing, not even smacking, sometimes just for other kinds of punishment that don't involve physical punishment. And that is my concern. And it's part of a greater movement to undermine parental authority. That's my view. But let's face it, if there's something good comes out of this, if the government sticks to its own principles and doesn't attack children with needles full of an experimental vaccine, then maybe that's a good thing.
Briefly, Tam Laird, we've seen in Scotland advice to primary schools that children as young as 5 can choose their own name or their own gender without parental consent.
My solution to that one is get your kids out of state schools. There is absolutely no legal requirement at this moment in time to send your children to state school. That may change. I know Scotland would love to go down the road in Sweden and actually outlaw homeschooling, but I think the solution there is get your kids out of state school.
The reason, Dr. Bernard Gallagher, why I mentioned that example of children being able to choose their gender or which toilets they use out with parental influence is that this is a state land grab of parental autonomy, isn't it? And surely that's a dangerous precedent to set. It's up to parents to raise their kids, not the government.
No, I mean, the state isn't trying to interfere needlessly or inappropriately in family life. What it's trying to do, in the case of Wales, is deter people from smacking their children. And as we've said already on this programme, children aren't afforded the rights that are afforded to everybody else. You cited a moment ago, what's wrong with a little tap on the hand? Would you tap your partner on the hand? Would you tap your partner on the face? Would you, sort of quite violently remonstrate with one of your colleagues? You wouldn't do. So why do you do it to a child? And it's doubly important not to do it to a child because it's not effective, and there are other much more appropriate ways of actually bringing up your children. All the government in Wales is trying to do is encouraging more appropriate parenting. Now, the state is involved in all aspects of our lives. It runs the National Health Service.
Exactly.
That's a very good thing. So I think this thing about, again, this obsession with overstating involvement is a sort of myth, basically. All the government of Wales is trying to do is to ensure that encourage children to be brought up in a more appropriate way without sort of inflicting violence upon them.
Briefly, I want to come back, if I may, to Anna May Mangan in a moment, but you're shaking your head there, Tam Laird.
Yeah, I was. I mean, I think it's just a bit disingenuous to say that the state doesn't want to get involved in family life and tell people that there is far too much state overreach. And do I think the state should be running the health service? Absolutely not. And the state makes a horrible parent. Now, you're talking about encouragement and encouraging children. Why don't you encourage parents, instead of threatening with violence that big men with sticks will come and throw you in the jail if you smack your kids? Why not just encourage parents to look after their children and not to hit them and to be peaceful parents? Encourage, don't punish. Take your own advice here.
OK, and finally, Anna May Mangan, what if this is weaponised by a bad actor, somebody that wants to get revenge on a neighbour or a friend or a family member by reporting abuse that isn't happening?
Well, I mean, I think that's a risk any responsible parent would take. But I find it interesting, this talking about the state and owning children. So you have your children, people think they own them, therefore they can smack them. But if someone else smacked their child, for example, a teacher, they'd lose their cool, I'm guessing most of them. You wouldn't smack a friend's child. So because it's your child, it doesn't mean that you have a license to behave badly. So, I mean, yeah, so the state argument interfering doesn't follow through for me.
My deep thanks to all three of you for what has been a balanced and fascinating conversation. Tam Laird is the leader of the Scottish Libertarian Party. Dr. Bernard Gallagher is an independent child protection researcher. And Anna May Mangan By the way, Anna May, tell me about your books. Can you plug your book, please?
Oh, well, I had a best-selling London Irish memoir about my family. There were 13 children in my parents on both sides, and sometimes they smacked, but 2 generations away, we've all changed. But yeah, it's a funny, makes you laugh, makes you cry. Read
What's it called?
Me and Mine.
Me and Mine by Anna May Mangan. You'll have to come into the studio and tell us all about it. Thanks so much to all three of you. A really interesting conversation.